Today we have a crazy revenge story of avenging someone's cat's death. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, evidence that having annoying coworkers is the worst thing ever. To be honest, everything was fine for a long time in the place where I earned my daily upkeep. I worked as a researcher at a university. I didn't really teach because something about teaching didn't really get to me, but I was diligent in my research work. I was sure to keep it together and not fall short of deadlines or anything of the sort. But amidst everything, there was one person who never stopped to irritate the living daylights out of me. His name was Matt. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not one to shy away from a challenge or a confrontation when necessary, but Matt? Well, he was something else entirely. With his smug grin and carefree attitude, it seemed like he took pleasure in making my life just a little bit more difficult every chance he got. Matt was a bit younger than everybody else. He was the most recent addition to the university academic force, and at that time, I felt he was acting out because of this. Maybe to try to make sure that he's not sidelined or put in an uncomfortable spot by the older staff members, so he's striking first to show that he's not one to be played with. This was what I thought. It all started with little things. Quite innocent, not to mean anything on their own, but collectively, you would know it was a game to him, and it was enough to drive anyone mad. Misplaced files, trashed printed copies, forgotten coffee mugs, finishing the brew and not making any, you name it. At first, I brushed it off as harmless office banter, part and parcel of working in close quarters with other people. I mean, he was young. He was allowed to be mischievous to an extent. But as time went on, Matt's antics grew increasingly bold, increasingly personal. And this did not sit right with me. Not in the least. It was a general thing, so it did not specifically apply to me at first. Then, somehow, he made me the major subject of his childish antics. Imagine coming home on a busy morning and having to beat the traffic. You're hoping the day goes by as smoothly and as easily as possible, and then it doesn't because of someone's silly pranks. But as I rounded the corner into the parking lot, my groggy haze was shattered by a sight that made my blood boil. Matt's car parked smack dab in the middle of my spot. Let me paint you a picture of this parking lot. It wasn't exactly spacious to begin with, and with everyone jostling for a spot close to the entrance, tensions ran high on a good day. But this was a whole new level of audacity. But thankfully, I didn't have to hustle for parking spaces like most people did. There was one assigned to me by the university. It was somewhat the icing on the cake for my job offer, and I loved it. I'll admit, my first reaction was disbelief that day in the parking lot. Different thoughts came through my head in that instant. Maybe I'd parked in the wrong row, or maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. That was impossible since I've been parking there for years now, even before Matt came around. It was general public knowledge that that was mine, so no other person tried to park there, not even on days when the parking lot was congested and without easily accessible space. But no, there it was, plain as day, Matt's beat-up sedan taking up residence in the one spot I'd claimed as my own. The annoyance bubbled up inside me like a kettle about to boil over. I mean, come on! Was it too much to ask for a little common courtesy? I'd never had any issues with Matt before. Sure, he could be a bit of a nuisance around the office, but this was crossing a line. And the day was just starting. There were lots of other places he could have parked his beat-up car in, but he chose my spot. I took a deep breath, trying to quell the rising tide of frustration. I mean, what choice did I have? I couldn't exactly move his car myself, tempting as it was. So, with a resigned sigh, I trudged back to my car and found another spot. Far less convenient, but better than nothing. I proceeded into the office to talk to him, to see that he moved his car from my spot to another place before others came in. I found him by the coffee table, spoke to him, and he acted like he'd heard all I had to say. I saw him pick up his key and head out to move his car. I followed shortly after I'd given him enough time to move his car from my spot, and what did I find? I saw his car move from the center of the parking spot to just halfway away from the spot and into the spot beside mine. It was as if he was trying to claim ignorance of still not being parked in my spot or slam a big, "I don't give a freak" to my face. I strongly believe that it was the latter. It was Matt after all, right? It was his MO. Every time I walked past Matt's office or heard his obnoxious laugh echoing through the office, I couldn't help but seethe with resentment. It was like he had singled me out, like he was trying to get under my skin. And you know what hurt the most about it? It was that it worked. By the end of the day, that little action of his had me ready to tear my hair out. All thanks to one little parking spot and the jerk who'd taken it from me. And the crazy thing is that this was just the beginning of how Matt irritated my life before I gave him a piece of his own pie. The parking spot marked the beginning of our little feud. As the days turned into weeks, it became abundantly clear that Matt's parking antics weren't just a one-time fluke. I saw it become a regular occurrence suddenly, a twisted game of cat and mouse that he seemed all too eager to play. It was like he had a radar for my spot, a sixth sense that led him straight to it every morning. No matter how early I arrived, no matter how carefully I tried to keep my movements under the radar, there he was, his car parked snugly in the one spot I'd claimed as my own. At first, I tried to brush it off, to chalk it up to coincidence. But there was no way it could be coincidental that he managed to find my parking spot day after day. I'll admit, it got to me. More than I care to admit. Every time I saw his car in my spot, it was like a slap in the face. A reminder that no matter how hard I worked or how early I arrived, Matt would always find a way to get under my skin. It was evident to me that it was not an incident of any kind. And in a way, it felt like he knew exactly how his actions were affecting me mentally, and he reveled in every minute of my discomfort. And the worst part was that it wasn't just affecting me outside of work. No, it was seeping into every aspect of my life, poisoning my mood and sapping my productivity. I found it harder and harder to concentrate, to focus on the task at hand, when all I could think about was getting back at Matt for his petty little games. Before you say I should have been the bigger person, let me tell you categorically that there was no being a bigger person. It was just impossible to let a man who refused to leave his teenage instinct where it belonged. Matt's relentless assault on my peace of mind pushed me to my limit, and I decided something had to be done. But how? The first thing that came to my head was not to play silly childish pranks with him, it was taking it the professional way. Talking to HR or management seemed like the logical first step, so that's exactly what I did. I laid out the situation, explaining in painstaking detail how Matt's repeated parking infractions were affecting my work and my mental well-being. But to my dismay, my concerns were met with little more than a sympathetic nod and a promise to look into it. It was not the first time I had heard that statement when a complaint had been lodged to them, so I understood perfectly. It was clear that they didn't see the issue as seriously as I did, leaving me feeling even more powerless than before. After this, I was left with only one option: take matters into my own hands. And to be honest, the possibilities were endless, from harmless pranks to more creative solutions that would have shocked him to his core. On the one hand, I wanted to make sure my revenge was satisfying, a true testament to the frustration and anger I'd been feeling for weeks on end. But on the other hand, I had to be careful not to escalate the situation further. I could not have the matter blow up to management. I had not been called for disciplinary action by the school authorities. I didn't want Matt shenanigans to be the reason why I would have that daint on my record. So what did I do? Do you know that statement that if they go low, you go lower? Well, if you're familiar with the interpretation, you can guess what I did. I went lower. It was the perfect balance between mischief and restraint, but nothing so extreme as to cause any real harm. The important thing was it was retaliatory, not to endanger anyone. I needed to make him feel as much inconvenience as he made me feel by parking in my spot repeatedly. In a way, you could say I was avenging the rest of the staff since I was not the only one he had inconvenienced in the past. And in a way, it was a good thing that I wasn't alone. This way, he would have no real reason for thinking I was the culprit out of every other person that he is either annoyed or irritated by his childish behavior. One aspect of my plan involved a classic prank, the old switcheroo. I knew that Matt had a particular fondness for his morning cup of coffee, so I took advantage of this habit to send him a not-so-subtle message. I discreetly switched the labels on his coffee mug, replacing his usual Matt. I thought to change the label to one that read, "I park in other people's spots," to serve as a subtle jab at him, but there was no way that he wouldn't trace it back to me. Instead, I used Matt the Jerk. The worst part for him was that he didn't notice the label until he heard people laughing at him as he held onto the mug the next morning. This was just one. I decided to make a play for a second jab at him. I went after his office chair. Matt loved his chair. Everyone knew it. He had a way of recommending the brand to others when he had the chance to, so I thought it would be funny to make it squeak like crazy. Late one night, when virtually nobody was around, I snuck into his office with a can of air. I knew his door would be unlocked because it was the only day he left it open for the cleaning agents to do their work. I sprayed the air under Matt's chair and it made the chair squeak with every move. As you must know, he was far from pleased, but there was no one to direct his fury at. Honestly, I'm willing to bet that this guy was just a total jerk, and it wasn't even necessarily targeted harassment. He just kind of picked a spot and decided, that's his spot now, Matt the jerk. It's a pretty fitting mug. That said, our next story is Lessons My Parents Learned in a Hard Way. I grew up with my parents in downtown Chicago. I grew up knowing that my parents had bought a house, although not on a mortgage. My father was a banker, and my mother worked in one of the biggest 5-star hotels in town as a manager. I can't remember if we ever had to worry about anything, especially financially. I mean, my parents were the true definition of young and getting it. However, our bed of roses didn't last long. My dad lost his job in the bank and he got into debts that ran into millions of dollars, thanks to an investment that initially seemed promising but ended up being a total bad idea. We had to depend on my mom's salary for sustenance. We were trying so hard to find our feet again, but the more we tried, the more whatever was chasing after our finances seemed to catch up with us. At some point, my mom's health began to fail. I don't know, but I guess she never had to worry so much about so many things at the same time. She single-handedly took care of so many people at the same time, which took a huge toll on her. Eventually, she couldn't sustain her job due to her ill health. When we thought we had seen the worst, the unexpected happened again. The people my dad owed came fiercely at us, and it was bad that my dad had used our house as collateral. Yeah, we lost the house, and life had to move on. We moved to a suburban town in Chicago, and we started our lives from scratch. We got an apartment whose owner didn't stay too far away. At first, that didn't seem like a problem. We felt so because he lived about 2 houses away, and we didn't see any possibility of him being a bugger. Then, we didn't know that it was possible for us to have issues with anyone. Or better said, for people to have issues with us. Not to sound proud, I was so confident that we were some of the most easygoing people you would ever meet around, so it was a bit strange when we began to lose our peace in our new house. Let me start with how the landlord insisted that we pay our monthly rent up front. Sometimes even though that was not the agreement. The first time we heard that, we were shocked as to why he would say such, because we all knew that it wasn't the norm in the country, unless otherwise stated. To be honest, it was one of the most ridiculous things I have heard to date. So out of curiosity, I began to keep a closer eye on him since he didn't live far away. I think I did so because a part of me wondered if he suffered a mental crisis, just so I could tell my family to be careful. Well, thank God I decided to watch out for who he truly was because I found out that he was a drunk. It was funny because I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I mean, someone who drank and still drove his car, then got back home late while he managed to stagger into his apartment. I was terrified. I knew something didn't sit right with him, but I didn't expect to have seen those pictures of him. It became clearer why he demanded that we pay our rent up front. He obviously needed more money to satisfy his alcohol thirst. After I noticed who he was, I decided to do a little background check on him with a friend I'd met in the neighborhood. Let's call his name P. I was shocked to find out from P that he was once married with kids. He told me, as a matter of fact, that his wife was one of the most gorgeous women in the neighborhood. They had 2 kids together. P told me that he wasn't sure that the wife ever had a good time at home. He knew all of this because he had lived in that neighborhood throughout his teenage years. He went on to recount how he was violent towards his wife and he came back drunk every other day. One time he got so upset that he lost it with his wife and kids. According to P, he beat the living daylights out of them. That was the last time he saw his family. He was arrested, detained, and charged in court. That was when I knew that we had gotten an apartment from a jailbird. If he had gone to jail and back and he still wasn't reformed, then it was obvious that something was fundamentally wrong somewhere. At home, my dad had insisted that he wasn't going to pay any rent up front, and that he would do as it ought to be done. I think my dad's stubbornness was a major trigger for the landlord. Our home literally became a war zone, and it was worse when my dad was bent on not looking for another apartment for the time being. I guess it was because his rent was the most affordable in the area. I didn't like it that my family was embarrassed every other day, but it was as if my parents cared less. I guess that was what hurt the most. Those scenarios took me back down memory lane. Memories of how we lived in a semi-detached duplex flooded my head. I remember how we were seen as a luxurious household around the neighborhood. I don't know if this gave me comfort, but I was proud to have been born and raised in my family. I remembered my room. It was twice as spacious as my present room. I remember when my parents decided to get an interior decorator to add beauty and glamour to my room on my 13th birthday. This was months before everything fell apart. The day my dad gave us all the shocking news that our house had been confiscated because he had jumped at a wrong investment and had used our house as collateral was the saddest day in my life. To be honest, my dad was that kind of man who believed in taking audacious risks. Looking back now, sometimes I would say those risks were calculated risks, and sometimes I would say those risks were not necessary at all. To top it all off, my dad was a strong man who liked to dwell on his own perception of things. There were days my mom tried to counsel him on some of his ideas, but he would remain adamant regarding them. Now, we all had to deal with a mess that could have been long avoided if he'd listened to my mom in the past. Ever since everything went downhill, my parents were merely trying very hard to get back on their feet again. There were times that they didn't meet up with the rent, and those were the days I knew and accepted that we had truly fallen from grace to grass. I remember a particular occasion when this happened. The landlord had taken it so personally that I wondered if he was capable of hurting any of us. He blabbed, shouted, talked, and made it clear to everyone that we were poor and struggling. He threatened to call the police on us if we didn't vacate the apartment. It was a sour sight that got me shaken and terrified. My dad eventually got the money and even paid up front just to save our heads. Then, after some days, something unexpected happened to me. It is something I will never be able to shake off or write off. Before then, I had noticed that our landlord had some violent tendencies. I'd heard stories of how violent he'd been in the past, but I didn't know that I would be a victim. It started with how he behaved whenever he drove past me. He liked to give me a particular side eye strong enough to see the hair on my body. I remember that I wasn't the kind of person who allowed myself to be noticed around the neighborhood, so I wasn't even sure if they knew that my parents were parents. Except, of course, he had kept a very close eye on me. Another time he drove past me, he had swerved his hand a bit on the steering, which was close enough to knock me off the road. I had never been that startled in my life before. I stood transfixed and confused, and it was even funny that he went ahead to park his car and hopped into his apartment as though nothing happened. I walked away briskly because I didn't know what he was up to, and I obviously didn't want to find out. I knew then that he knew who my parents were, and he was up to something terrible. I struggled with what I should do next, and I didn't know if the man had wanted to get me hit on purpose or not. After careful thought, I decided to give the landlord the benefit of the doubt. I decided not to tell my parents so as to not raise any cause for alarm. I went about my normal business until I realized that I had made a mistake. The next time I had an encounter with the landlord, it was a terrible experience for me. Even though I began to avoid the landlord because I honestly didn't know what he was up to, I chose to play it safe. On that fateful day, I was on my way back from the grocery store where I was asked to get a few things for the house. I couldn't say when the landlord attacked me, but I knew it happened suddenly, like a dream. Even though I tried to walk home briskly for fear of running into him again, I still felt a tap on my shoulders. I shuddered in fear, wondering who touched me. As I turned, I felt a hard blow on my face, then on my chest, and all over my body. I remember shouting for help because I felt I was going to die. I looked at him one last time, and I passed out at the sound of a police siren, which I heard faintly. The next time I woke up in the hospital. I tried to get up, but my strength betrayed me. I fell back into bed and drifted off to sleep again. I did this for 3 days, waking and drifting back to sleep at intervals. My parents assured me that I would be fine, but I could see the shame on their faces. If they had listened to me, we would have left the neighborhood, and I might not have broken 2 of my ribs. I felt so much pain, both physically and mentally. Before I got discharged from the hospital, we got news that the landlord had been arrested and charged in court for attempted murder. I smiled wryly, wondering if he really wanted to see me dead. When he was asked why he did what he did, he told them that he hated my parents' guts and wanted them out of his property. He was sentenced to prison for taking the law into his own hands and causing harm to a girl who was innocent. My parents were asked to suspend the rent for 1 year as compensation for all the assaults and trauma inflicted on their daughter. But I was surprised that my parents turned down the offer. Things had gotten better for my dad and he was trying to get our home back. However, he swore not to allow us to spend an extra month in that house. What we experienced was a bitter lesson, and my parents had learned theirs in a harder way. You know, I was gonna say it's a bit crazy the details of the story, but then I remembered OP said this is in or kind of around Chicago, and if anybody knows anything about Chicago, there are some definite not so great parts. I mean, if you're really struggling in Chicago and you can only afford the cheapest option for rent, you probably will end up in a pretty rough spot. Although, to be fair, you probably could argue that for honestly most major cities. Our next story is, I avenged my cat's death and found peace. I grew up in a suburban kind of house, those kind that had cozy little neighborhoods where houses snuggled close together like old friends. After my parents passed, I returned home because I couldn't deal with the loss right away. It was supposed to be for a couple of days, but the couple of days turned into a couple of weeks. And after a year, I knew there was no way I was just going to up and move out again. At least, not until something really pushed me to do it. I was just Becca, a regular girl just trying to make it through each day without any trouble. But trouble had a name, and it was Mrs. Monroe, the queen of nastiness who lived right next door. She didn't used to stay next door. I just came home one time from college and found that there was a new neighbor called Mrs. Monroe, and something in me just didn't try to bond or create that warm, neighborly feeling. I never liked her then, although there was no exact reason, but since moving back to my parents' house, my days never seemed to start right because of her. She was like a dark cloud hanging over my head, always ready to rain down misery. She just rubbed me off wrong on most days, and the only thing I had to console me most times was Oscar, my cat. He was as ingenious as orange cats could get, but he was legit everything I could have wished for in a cat. The drama, stress, companionship, and subtle care, but also vindictive when I refused to give him treats. Yeah, he was that. But that did not change the fact of who Mrs. Monroe was, and at some point in your life, you reach a particular stage where you just say, freak it all and react based on your anger. Mrs. Monroe lived with her boyfriend. He was younger, not that she was elderly, just older than the average youth, probably in her late 40s or something. I never actually cared about getting her age, but what I knew for certain is that every day felt like a battle living next door to Mrs. Monroe and her boyfriend. They weren't just annoying neighbors, they were tormentors, determined to make my life miserable. It started with little things like the time I walked outside to find rude drawings all over my car. Mrs. Monroe thought it was hilarious, but to me it was just another jab in the ribs. No matter how many times I confronted her, she denied it with a smirk plastered on her face. One morning I decided to do some early morning shopping, and I didn't bother to check my car. And of all the things to draw on my car, I realized that there was a male genital organ drawing at the passenger side of my car. It would have been better, or at least less horrifying, if I'd seen it before going out. I could have taken the bus instead of trying to get the stain off as usual, but I didn't. I only found out when a stuck-up mother walked up to me saying I should be ashamed of myself for driving around with that kind of image to a public space where kids would be. I came down to see a Picasso-worthy drawing of a private organ on my car. Livid does not quite do justice to how and what I felt at that moment. There was only one place it could have come from: Mrs. Monroe and her immature boyfriend. I returned home immediately and tried to confront her about it, since she was the owner of the apartment, not the boyfriend. And as you could have guessed, she didn't take my complaint seriously either. This was just one of those ways that they set out to continually frustrate my life. Another time I woke up and wanted to clear out the trash, right? I took the trash out, only to find that my bins had vanished. It wasn't just a coincidence. Mrs. Monroe had taken them. I was sure of it. But when I confronted her, she just shrugged and told me to get lost. It was like she was playing a game and I was the only one who didn't know the rules. She was making me lose my mind and I just couldn't take it anymore. I needed help. Someone to put an end to Mrs. Monroe's reign of terror. So I turned to the police, hoping they would see through her lies and finally give me the justice I deserved. But it was like banging my head against a brick wall. It wasn't just that Mrs. Monroe had connections and they weren't about to go against her. It was about the fact that all I really had was my hunch. I knew it in my gut. But apparently, gut feeling is not what got people convicted of crimes. Not even the slightest misdemeanor, so they told me to get lost. Just in a better way than Mrs. Monroe could have ever put it. So, no matter how many times I called the police about another prank or misdeed, no matter how many times I begged for their help, nothing changed. They asked for evidence of the actions, and I never had any. I mean, it was Mrs. Monroe and her lame butt boyfriend. They were never going to let me have any evidence of the trash they do. The whole point of their actions was that no one would ever believe that they were really trying to mess with me. Mrs. Monroe continued to harass me, her actions growing bolder with each passing day. If she moved 1 inch today, the next day she would be 3 inches deep, and as much as I wanted to fight back, I felt powerless against her and her creepy boyfriend. Do you know how they say all is fair game in war aside from unarmed civilians? In this case, I thought innocent bystanders were not fair game in this whole charade that we had going on. The morning it all changed started like any other morning living next to the loud house beside me. It was an argument coming from their place that alerted me. Then I stood up preparing to start my business of the day, only to find Oscar lying lifeless in the yard. At first, I couldn't believe it. There was no way Oscar could genuinely be that still. He was always up to something. So I thought maybe he heard me coming and chose to be silly, play dead to scare me for a bit. But I soon realized that he wasn't playing dead. The rage I felt in that instant was like nothing I had ever experienced before in my life. I knew who the attack must have come from, but I still didn't want to believe it. The banter was annoying, but I didn't want to believe that she could do something that cruel, that heartless. I had Oscar since the 3rd year of college, when it felt like everything was going downhill academically. I got depressed, and that drove me out of the depressed state I was in due to his ever-annoying self. It hurt to see that he was gone. Before I made any conclusions, I decided to ask around to see if anyone knew what happened to Oscar. He was mostly an indoor cat, but sometimes he liked to run out on the lawn chasing butterflies, or something that human eyes could not take a proper look at. But what hurt even more was Mrs. Monroe's reaction. I walked up to her, asking if she knew what happened to Oscar. I was expecting to see at least a shred of sadness in her eyes that an animal had died, since she had pets of her own. What did she do instead? She just laughed in my face. She boasted about the fact that she was responsible for Oscar's demise, as he never seemed to stay in his place. So, she knowingly lured him in and fed him large amounts of rat poison. And there she was, taunting me with her lack of guilt. It was like she took pleasure in my pain, reveling in her own cruelty. The tears that fell from my face were hotter than anything else. The hurt reminded me of the day I received news of my parents' accident. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could someone be so callous, so devoid of empathy? Mrs. Monroe's actions shattered any illusion of humanity I had left for her. She was a monster, and the fact was now clear as day in my head. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I knew I couldn't let her get away with it, couldn't let her continue to hurt me and those I loved. I had to do something, anything to make her pay for what she had done. With the tears still in my eyes, I walked away from her door and decided that I was going to make her pay for what she had done, even if I didn't have any evidence aside from what she told me to my face. After she wickedly took Oscar from me, I decided to leave the town, get back to my life and stop living in the shadows. But before I left, I knew I had to make Mrs. Monroe pay. But how? She seemed untouchable in a way, like that terrible villain in a movie who always gets away with their crimes. I mean, the worst of the worst types of villains. But then, like a bolt of lightning, it hit me, her dogs. Mrs. Monroe adored those dogs and treated them like royalty. They were her pride and joy, her precious little show dogs worth a fortune. And that's when I realized they were her weakness. It was the perfect place to attack. She had taunted me for months and finally ended it by poisoning my pet. It was only fair game that I came at her in a similar manner, but I couldn't be like that. There was no way I was going to kill the dogs. Even in seeking revenge for my cat's death, I knew where to draw the line. So I hatched a plan. A risky, daring plan that would make Mrs. Monroe regret ever crossing me. I had started packing my things together so that it wouldn't be suspicious when I finally left. It was obvious to almost everyone that I was leaving. Then, late one night, when the whole world should have been asleep, her silly, immature boyfriend decided to throw a party in her absence. I was familiar with the drill. When that happened, the dogs were locked out in the kennel because, from what I could gather, he was not really a fan of the dogs. I went to where the dogs were locked in and opened the gate for them to come out. It was nerve-wracking and every creak of the fence made me jump out of my skin, but I was determined, fueled by a burning desire for revenge. And so, with a steady hand and a silent prayer, I reached out and took what was rightfully mine. One by one, I scooped up Mrs. Monroe's prized show dogs, each one more precious than the last. They didn't put up a fight. Too sleepy to even notice as I cradled them in my arms like precious cargo. And then with a final glance back at the house where Mrs. Monroe lay sleeping, I made my escape into the night. But I couldn't keep the dogs with me for too long. It was way too risky, too dangerous, so I did the only thing I could think of. I gave them away. I reached out to a friend of mine in the UK and asked what he thought about owning the dogs. He was cool with taking 2. So I sent the 3 his way and asked him to give the 3rd to anyone he knew would be nice to the dogs. But before I did, I was sure to remove the collars on their neck. I couldn't be certain that there was no chip in them. Later that week, I was fully packed and I bolted. But this wasn't before I saw the uproar in the whole neighborhood when news got out that Mrs. Monroe's dogs were missing. Of course, I pretended to help find them to throw off the scent of suspicion, and I was good to go. I think where OP really lucked out here was the fact that the dogs weren't microchipped themselves. In this day and age, especially if you have something that you would consider show dogs or prize dogs, I mean, even if you just have a dog you genuinely care about, you would get them microchipped so that if you do lose them, or God forbid somebody tries to steal them and ships them out of the country, you might be able to still find them. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.